Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. There is a YouTube channel called Eyebrow Cinema, which I highly recommend that you check out. Eyebrow Cinema did a fascinating video called Night of the Living Dead and the Prison of Intent. Now, to those of you who may not know, the original movie, Night of the Living Dead, was made, I believe, in 1968. Had a black leading character. Yes, George A. Romero, the director, had the courage to cast a black man in the lead role. At a time when that was not common. Now, what's interesting about that choice is that race relations, civil rights, was not the intent of the movie. Yet, that is something that can be read into it, according to Eyebrow Cinema. Now, what's very interesting, the actor's name, by the way, was Dwayne Jones. I say that because I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his name. Dune. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. He played the main character, the character Ben, in Night of the Living Dead. Now, Eyebrow Cinema contrasts this with the other movies of the period that had black leading characters, and most of these movies, of course, starred the incomparable Sidney Poitier. Sidney Poitier, who I believe is still alive, is one of the great pioneers in cinema. Now, Eyebrow Cinema was contrasting this because Sidney Poitier starred in movies that were explicitly intended to be movies about civil rights and race relations and a dialogue between white and black characters. Whereas Night of the Living Dead is not. Yet Eyebrow Cinema felt that Night of the Living Dead was more, how shall we put it, was a better way to examine race relations than that, because it was not intended for the movie to be about civil rights, yet Eyebrow Cinema believes that you can read civil rights into the story. The idea that you could have this movie where a black main character is fighting against evil white zombies, and also in the kind of the relationship between the main character Ben and the other white characters, and the fact that he's not cowed. He's not like cowed to the white man. He's not like trying to be some kind of the Sidney Poitier style black character. But the fact that he has an openly antagonistic relationship with some of the characters. And then in one scene, he beats the crap out of this white guy that he's teamed up with. So the idea that George A. Romero was being a little bit more daring in Night of the Living Dead than what you saw in like the film starring Sidney Poitier. Now, what does all this have to do with Star Wars? Well, we'll get there in just a second. Eyebrow Cinema believed that the movies that were intentionally about race relations, and those include movies to this very day, sometimes if that's the intended message, he doesn't feel that they're as effective as a movie where maybe it wasn't intended. So maybe, this is my own spin on that, maybe Hollywood and like independent studios should focus more on making movies that star people of color, but are not just there to be movies about civil rights. Don't just cast black people in movies about civil rights. Cast them in movies. The black actors, the Latino actors, the Asian actors, and the white actors, don't put them in movies just to be there. Because, okay, we're making a drama about race relations. Go get some black actors. No, we need to make movies that just happen to star black people, Latino people, Asian people in the same roles you would give to white people. The reason the video that Eyebrow Cinema made includes the phrase prison of intent is because he felt that when your intention is to make a race relations movie, sometimes those movies turn out to be really overly simplified, overly sanitized. Now, let us be fair. When Sidney Poitier was in those films in the 60s, Lilies of the Field, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, movies like that, he was presented as a pretty sanitized black person. Whitewashed, if you will. The kind of black person that is sort of cleaned up to be acceptable to white audiences. Now, let's be absolutely clear. These are mainstream Hollywood movies. The Mirish brothers and the others involved in the production of these films were operating within very tight constraints. Because they could not afford to alienate too many audience members by being too daring. Now, you could argue that that's unethical, and I think you could make a good argument. But we must also remember that they didn't really have the freedom that we have today in terms of artistic expression. They had to operate within very tight constraints because that's all that they could do back then. So let us not begrudge them for the fact that those movies seem a little bit too sanitized, so to speak, because that's all they could do. The Night of the Living Dead, of course, not being a mainstream movie, being more of a cult movie that I think did pretty well financially, I believe. Yet, definitely not in the same ballpark in terms of being like a mainstream movie. Yeah, it cost $114,000 to make. Yes, you heard me right, $114,000. It made $30 million. So it was a hit. A huge hit. But I think that, not a mainstream movie, more of a cult horror movie. But I think that George A. Romero's decision to cast a black man in the lead role, while not intending it to be a movie about civil rights or race relations, there is much that we could read into the movie about race relations, about a black man standing up to the system, fighting off white zombies, being openly antagonistic with some of the white characters. You can interpret civil rights into it, even if that was not the intent. Okay, we're going to take a short break to hear about our sponsor. When we come back, we're going to talk about what in the world this has to do with Star Wars. See you in a moment. Hello there, this is Brennan Marr, host of Page Turners They Were Not, a Star Wars podcast. And I'm here to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is the best way to make a podcast. Why is that? Well, first off, it's free. Yes, you heard me right. Anchor is free. Anchor has all the tools you need to make a podcast from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on various platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can make money from your podcast. And get this, with no minimum listenership. That means you can make money even if no one listens to your podcast. That, of course, is not ideal, as Anchor will allow you to spread your podcast, bring in more viewers, and you can make more money because of it. Everything you need to make a podcast is in one place on Anchor. If you're interested, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you, and may the Force be with you. Okay, we're back. Now, I have talked before on my podcast about authorial intent. Authorial intent versus death of the author. Now, let me just briefly explain. Death of the author is the idea that once the work of art is complete and open to the public, that work of art is now in the hands of the public to interpret how they will, no matter what the director says. director, writer, painter, poet. Let me give you an example. J.K. Rowling. Okay. J.K. Rowling has said a lot of things after the fact. After the Harry Potter books have come out, she has said a lot of things. For instance, that Dumbledore is gay. Okay. Now that opens a whole other can of worms about what they call a queer catching. But we'll get to that. Now the question is, because that's not written in the books, if we go with the idea that the author's word is law, then we must accept everything J.K. Rowling says outside the books as defining what is in those books. So J.K. Rowling says Dumbledore is gay. If we go with the idea of authorial intent, if we accept that her word is law, then yes, Dumbledore is gay. However, if we invoke the idea of death of the author, which means that whatever the author says has no bearing on how I interpret that work, I can choose to interpret from the text that Dumbledore is gay, but I do not have to explicitly accept it. Because that was never explicitly said in the books. It was implied, but never said. Now, why do I say all this? Well, if the author's intent is to tell a race relations story, and we accept, well, in the case of a lot of movies about race relations, it's made explicit that, like in big bold neon letters, this is a movie about civil rights. And often those movies fall short. Many of them are very good, but they fall short. Not only does this mean that we need more Black, Latino, Asian filmmakers, but it also means that in a movie that's not intentionally about civil rights, we can interpret civil rights into the story. This brings us to the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And who is our secondary lead character but a black man? John Boyega as Finn. Now, Star Wars is kind of meant to not be connected to our own real world, in the idea that it is a fairy tale set in a galaxy far, far away. Now, it's true that the underpinnings of Star Wars have always had a political bent to them. In the case of Finn, the fact that he is black has no real bearing on the story. But what it does mean is that we can interpret that into the story. Here is the story of a young black man who was conformed to a system. Conformed to the First Order. A stormtrooper who was a pawn in the system. A cog in the gear, or a cog in the machine, so to speak. But he stands up and fights back. Firstly, he refuses to fire on civilians. Quite appropriate right now, I think. At first, he tries to run away. He just tries to get away. And as he says when he breaks Poe out, He says it's the right thing to do. And Poe's like, you need a pilot. And Finn's like, I need a pilot. So at first, Finn wants to run away. In running away, though, he does help Poe. And he does help Ray. Showing his good heart. But he tries to run away once they reach Maz's castle. But then takes a stand to rescue his friend Ray. Now, most everything he does during the Force Awakens and The Last Jedi is helping out a friend, but still having a desire to run away. Now, it's true that Finn was trying to get away from the Resistance ship in The Last Jedi in order to keep Rey safe. That was the reason. But, he's still trying to run away. But because of Rose, a young Asian woman, by the way, Finn learns to take a stand and proudly declare that he is rebel scum, as he puts it. In that moment, Finn embraces his destiny and says, no, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to fight back. And fight back he does. Now, a friend of mine this morning pointed out something interesting. There is a difference between Finn's hairstyle in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi than in The Rise of Skywalker. Finn's hair, as my friend pointed out, is more grown out in The Rise of Skywalker. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about black folks in America. Their hair is one of their defining traits. And there is a temptation of people trying to motivate them to make their hair more straightened. But many of them are proudly like, nope, I'm embracing my hair as it is. And I'm not going to change it to fit in with what's quote-unquote accepted. So arguably, you could say that Finn growing his hair into its more natural state in The Rise of Skywalker is yet another act of defiance against the First Order. The First Order, where everything was regimented, including his hairstyle. Now that brings us to Janna. Janna was a stormtrooper. There's no way that hair of hers could fit in a stormtrooper helmet unless it was cut short or straightened artificially. I think her hair is another act of defiance against the system. And also, the story of Finn fighting back, the story of Finn refusing to kill for the First Order. That story traveled, and Janna heard that story. And she and some of her other stormtrooper buddies revolted. They were inspired by Finn's defiance, and they joined the fight too. They fought in their own way. They're on Kafbir, I think the planet's called, and then joined up with the Resistance to fight back against the Final Order in The Rise of Skywalker during the Battle of Exegol. this is very appropriate for right now, I think. The story of a young black man who, by the way, was part of law enforcement, quote unquote, refusing to fire on innocent civilians. At first he wants to run, but then he learns to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to run. I'm not going to fight back. To quote Finn, no, I won't let them win. And the story of Finn's courage traveled. And also, Finn, a young black man, and Rose, a young Asian woman, inspired hope in those oppressed kids on Canto Bight. And that hope further grew when they learned of the legendary exploits of Luke Skywalker. But the acts of heroism of Finn and Janna in fighting back. And also, who leads the charge against the Final Order? Who arrives just in the nick of time with the ragtag fleet of freedom fighters behind him? Who should it be but Lando Calrissian? A black man who was sitting out of the fight. He was hiding out, more or less, on Pisana after having gone on an adventure with Luke. At first, he doesn't want to come in and join the fight. But he does come in. Yet again, the story of another person, another black person who was reluctant to join the fight, but then says, nope, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to fight for what's right. I'm going to fight for my freedom. Now, we can look back at The Empire Strikes Back and say that Lando was forced into a bad situation by a dictatorship. And Lando was kind of pressured into it because he had little choice, or else his city would be in serious trouble. But then Lando gained the courage to turn the tables on the Empire and fight back. Lando is another hero, a black man fighting back against an evil system. And the reason why I think this is fascinating is because this, I do not believe, was ever intended to be the reading of the Star Wars saga. But that's how I read it now. Or that's one way I choose to interpret it. That is, it is the story, especially the sequel trilogy, of these heroic people, a Latino, a black man, an Asian girl, fighting back against the evil system that wants to make them fit into conformity, that wants to rule the galaxy with an iron fist. But these young folks, the minorities, are saying, no, we're not going to let it happen. And you know what? I can think of no more appropriate story for right now. Even the story of Cassian Andor, a Latino man who's been fighting since he was a kid to rid the galaxy of an evil tyrant. Yes. Star Wars you can interpret in so many ways. But this is a fascinating way to interpret it as a story of minorities fighting back against a system that wants to crush them. And there is no more appropriate story for right now, I think, in the world of fantasy. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. I'm also going to leave a description or rather in the description, I will leave a link to the video that Eyebrow Cinema made about Night of the Living Dead, a video you might want to check out. My name is Brennan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. Thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.